All right. Well, thank everyone for being here on Zoom with all of us for the last panel of the Morale Conference, focusing on protecting U.S. elections from foreign interference. I would like to introduce our moderator, Professor Wolff, who is an expert in cybersecurity at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So, Professor Wolff, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our panelists and our topic.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for joining. This event is being recorded and live streamed via the Fletcher Facebook page live stream, and we're going to discuss today U.S. elections and foreign interference and what we should be doing about it, something which always seems important, perhaps never more so than when you're less than a month out from a presidential election. Four really wonderful panelists here to talk about this today, and I'm going to introduce each of them briefly and then begin some discussion. At the end, we'll save about 20-25 minutes for questions from the audience, so please feel free to submit those through the Q&A tool, and we will get to those later on in the panel. Joining me today, we have Dr. Thomas Parker, who worked in the Executive Office of the President, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the State Department's policy planning staff, the intelligence community, and the US Congress over the course of 30 years. He's currently teaching security studies at George Washington University. I'm also joined by Kemba Walden, an attorney in the Digital Security Unit at Microsoft, which operates at the intersection of cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection. Kemba primarily supports Microsoft's digital diplomacy team, specifically focused on the Defending Democracy program. And prior to Microsoft, she spent a decade in government at the Department of Homeland Security. We also have Clint Watts, a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and non-resident fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He's also a national security contributor for NBC News and MSNBC, and recently examined the rise of social media influence, publishing his first book titled Messing with the Enemy: Surviving in a Social Media World of Hackers, Terrorists, Russians, and Fake News. Finally, we're joined by Zhong, who's a program associate for the Kissinger Institute on China in the United States at the Wilson Center. At the Kissinger Institute, she manages Mapping China's Cultural Genome, a curated project that collects top-level speeches and commentary on China's global cultural ambitions. Her research interests include China's role in the East Asian political economy and how nationalist interests can impact business, technology, and cultural policies. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited by what a sort of diverse group of experts we have with a lot of knowledge in a lot of different parts of the world. And I want to start by asking each of you to talk a little bit about what is the nature of the election interference activity that you have been tracking or researching most closely, including activity that stops short of actually manipulating election results. But aims at trying to influence people or spread disinformation or other types of interference. Where does it originate from? What countries are you looking at most closely? And what forms concern you the most, right? As we gear up for a big presidential election in this country, what is it that you think is actually the thing we should be worrying about here, the thing we should be focusing on? So Clint, I'm going to come to you first to talk a little bit about your experience looking at Russia here.
Yeah, so beginning probably June of 2019, so about 15 months ago or so, we started monitoring foreign interference at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And I'd already been working with the Alliance for Securing Democracy with the Hamilton Dashboard and building different tools for aggregating data. And we were principally looking at Russia, Iran, and China, trying to do comparison, recognizing that they would somewhat be conflated or political parties would use them for their own purposes, depending on what the stance was. And so I would say that the Russian approach is the exact same in 2020 as it was in 2016. It's really no different. You can read in their overt news, they will be very explicit about who they want to win. They don't hide it. And so the FPRI team, which is about 30 interns, we've been analyzing, I think we've analyzed over 10,000 stories over the last 15 months, looking at the trends there. And, you know, what's pretty straightforward about it is Russia doesn't hide their preferences. Iran doesn't hide theirs. China plays a more neutral stance, but is always sort of couched in the greater geostrategic aims of China vis-a-vis the United States. So President Trump is both the head of state and a candidate going in. And so when we watch that as it's played out, Russia is still hitting all the boxes except for one, which we can't prove. Maybe Kemba can prove it since she works at Microsoft. But They are doing overt influence, right, with their state-sponsored news outlets. They are doing covert influence through social media accounts. We know that because this time around, we're much better at shutting them off. You'll see the Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, kind of across the board. You've seen shutdowns from these companies on Russia, what we call fringe network sites. You see the State Department designating essentially 7 or 8 different outlets as Russian connected outlets to Russian intelligence. We see reports from Microsoft and the hacking teams about maybe attempts at Burisma being hacked back earlier in the year, and now a report of up to a couple hundred attacks, cyber attacks coming from Russia. And you do see Iran and China there, but Iran's big weakness is they have no real reach in the US audience space. They don't have a strong message or a way to nudge or push the audience to a particular vote. And China is remarkable because, yes, they are conducting cyber attacks. They are trying to do influence. They pretty much stick to their broader long-run goals, which are more about trade, big tech wars, things like Huawei and TikTok, Xinjiang, and then also with respect to like pro-democratic protest. They signal lightly that they would prefer Biden, but it's also been interesting to watch the Chinese space as they debate which is better, a retrenched, retreating United States that's disorganized and chaotic that fights with itself, or maybe over the longer term, facing off against a Biden administration that may be more organized and have more international partners. When they do social media covert influence, the Chinese tend to be sloppy. It's just indicative of the fact that they haven't really picked up on the art yet. They get caught quite a bit. They're not as quite as sloppy as the Iranians, but they're close. And so, what I have to say about 2020, and I'll cut off here because I don't want to go too long, is in 2016, we were worried about ISIS and Russian interference going into election day. This time, I think we're worried about domestic interference and domestic disinformation and domestic terrorism going into election day. So it's almost inverted. The system's almost inverted on itself in the past 4 years.
Thank you. Really, really interesting points there. Kemba, I'm curious, I know Microsoft has released a lot of information about the different interference campaigns that they've witnessed. And I think one of the things that's been sort of interesting for me is the role that Microsoft and other private companies have really played in the build up to this election, taking a more public facing role informing people about this. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what Microsoft has been tracking in terms of election interference, and also sort of what you see as Microsoft's role in thinking about securing elections.
Thank you, Professor Wolff. And thank you for inviting me here for this important conversation. You're right, Microsoft does take an active role in this space. We believe that technology companies do have a role. If you think about it, some of our software is in elections infrastructure. Campaigns rely on us. Some of the voter registration data is stored in our clouds, not just ours, but in others. Technology can really help the resilience of our elections infrastructure. Now, Clint mentioned the attempt to compromise our elections infrastructure that we've noticed recently. We published a blog about it recently, and I'll give you some highlights here of what we've been seeing, and you're welcome to read the blog for more details. But I just want to point out the 3 actors that Clint also alluded to when he was talking about disinformation and his tracking there. First is strontium. We're also known as Fancy Bear, APT28, and the actor from Russia. It's the same group that was very active in both 2016 and 2018, as well as others in Europe. Credential theft seems to be their primary objective. We've seen them attack more than 200 organizations, including political campaigns, advocacy groups, parties, and political consultants. You think of it more of as a political ecosystem rather than any one particular party. And when they're successful, then they use that credential in subsequent intrusion and data exfiltration operations. And in 2020, the difference here is that we've seen them improving their evasion techniques, and they seem to be taking advantage of automation capabilities that expand scope and scale, really. In China, we've seen them take more of a reconnaissance opportunity. They're targeting organizations associated with the US presidential election. They've targeted non-campaign accounts of people affiliated with the Biden campaign, and in fact, one individual formerly associated with the Trump administration. The objective for these initial reconnaissance operations is still unknown, but the knowledge acquired by these activities gives them traceable validation of the accounts, and it leverages common online marketing methods to test the success rate of the websites that they are using for customized lures. And then the third actor I wanted to raise here is Phosphorus. We've seen this actor before. They're very busy. They're a fairly new player targeting Microsoft customers, frankly, though we've seen them before. I think we posted information about them last year. And their techniques are pretty clunky. They're still sort of in that spear phishing space. They're very fond of targeting personal email accounts, which will allow me now to make a plug for multi-factor authentication. They've been known to alter email forwarding rules of accounts after they've gained access to maintain surveillance even after passwords change, right? So again, another plug for multi-factor authentication here. But we've seen all three actors, we call them strontium, zirconium, and phosphorus, sort of active here in 2020 in similar ways that we've seen them active in prior elections.
Thank you. That's really, really sort of enlightening for a lot of us who I think are not following this in as much detail. And Thomas, I'm curious, you've worked in all different parts of government. You've worked on a lot of these different countries that we're interested in from the election interference perspective. Which of these different types of interference that you've been following do you think are most concerning? Do you think we should be paying the most attention to here?
Well, let me address the case of Iran, and let me discuss some worst case scenarios and why they're probably not going to take place. And that is, there was speculation in the past, and still to some degree in the present, that the Iranians might try something spectacular in order to influence the election in November. And that was, people thought mainly in terms of a major rocket attack against U.S. diplomatic facilities in Baghdad, or the military bases that we have in Iraq. There was some speculation several months ago about just trying to disrupt oil exports from the Persian Gulf. I think the consensus today is that these things are not going to happen. They're not going to happen for several reasons. For one thing, the Iranians are aware that Vice President Biden is probably going to win the election. That's what they want. So why disrupt things when things seem to be going your way? So that's one factor. Then there's also the factor of, if you launch a major rocket attack against U.S. facilities, could it be counterproductive? Could it redound to President Trump's benefit? Could there be military retaliation on the part of the United States? So Iran doesn't want either of those. And with respect to the scenario of disrupting oil exports from the Gulf, that's a less valid, viable option now in the era of the virus, because the oil market is so loose, the prices are so far down that even if you disrupted some oil facilities, oil exports, it might not have that much of an impact on oil prices. So that's why the Iranians probably have set aside that option. So if we're looking at kind of worst case scenarios, most disruptive case scenarios, it looks like the Iranians are going to continue to pursue a relatively low profile with respect to trying to do something major to disrupt the election in November. So I'll stop there.
Always good to have some good news when you're talking about election interference, that there's somebody who we're not expecting to make a lot of trouble. So that's great to hear. Ray, I'm curious, when we think about election interference, I think a lot of people's minds first go to Russia. And as Clint mentioned, the question of sort of what China wants and what China's doing is often a little less clear or a little bit less in the headlines. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about sort of from your perspective, what you've seen as China's interests in this election, what they're hoping for, and what kinds of activity we've seen out of the Chinese government.
Sure. So this week there was the vice presidential debate between candidates Senator Kamala Harris and Vice President Pence, which was broadcast in part in China. They live streamed the event, but the feed did cut out momentarily, showing this blank screen and something like, oh, this broadcast is temporary, experiencing issues. It resumed later, but it cut out the segment when the two candidates stopped talking about China and the United States' policy towards China. So this anecdote is really briefly how China sees US elections and American electoral politics, broadly speaking. No matter what the outcomes are, their preferences are usually centered around the core interests of the Chinese state, domestically because they can control a lot of factors, that media, civil society, discourse, but increasingly, we're also starting to see China respond to, try to mitigate and nip in the bud foreign criticism. So typically when China manages information that they deem as rumors or misinformation, including certain types of criticism levied against the government during the COVID-19 crisis earlier this year, they really try to do so from a Chinese-defined cybersecurity standpoint. But when China defines cybersecurity, they also mean the political security of the Chinese ruling government, and because of the way he centered himself, that it also means protecting Xi Jinping. So as they're really expanding propaganda efforts through traditional outlets like CGTN, the Global Broadcast Network, Global Times, and People's Daily, two types of state-affiliated media, it's mostly aimed at emphasizing China's political definitions of, how it's defined Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan issues, how it's been highlighting shortfalls in American policy developments, including how America's been handling the COVID crisis, and quote unquote, telling China's story. So this phrase is something that Xi Jinping himself has been really keen on. He's made several inspections to Chinese media outlets and regulators over the years. And the idea of certain types of messaging on China is something that they are really trying to put a lot of resources into promoting. So to circle back to the elections, China tends to see politicians like Biden as a sort of known quantity through his past foreign policy record. They've had, I think the only exposure they've had with Trump was through, dealing with his administration since his inauguration. And so this has meant, I think, working with Xi Jinping through his personal relationship, through negotiating certain factors in the phase 1 of the US-China trade deal, but also China, for the most part, has not really had to give up a lot or sort of move backwards on any significant policy concessions. And so throughout the rest of the election season, I can definitely see China sort of making assessments and then just adapting to the political environment within China, at least from most open source researchers' perspective.
Thank you. I'm curious, sort of thinking about the past 4 years when the United States government has really been starting to grapple with this question of election interference and attempting to respond to it in a variety of different ways, some very policy oriented, some more technical. What do you think of how effective those interventions have been? And I'm interested both in sort of what you think of the government interventions, like issuing indictments, holding hearings, publishing intelligence reports, what kinds of difference you think that has or has not made, and also in what you think of some of the efforts put out by other stakeholders, by private companies, by international organizations, whether you see progress being made since the last election, or whether in fact you think that a lot of these efforts have been sort of largely symbolic or largely ineffective in dealing with this. And Kemba, I'm going to come to you first. You mentioned multi-factor authentication as sort of one thing you'd like to see more of. How well do you think we've done at trying to ramp up some of our election security?
Sure, and I'll give you both my perspective from my time in the government during the 2016 presidential election and my time since out in the private sector. I'll say first that from the government perspective, the government did quite a bit, frankly. The first step was basically to get the entire country to acknowledge that there was a problem. That sounds simpler than it is. That was an actually complex, nuanced process to get all the states to understand that there was a problem in all the departments and agencies. The second step then was to get the intelligence community to agree on attribution, but not just attribution, but to make a public statement of attribution. Those first two steps were coordinated and were important, and they started in the Obama administration and are carried through this administration. And I say that only to say that there was a relatively seamless objective between the two administrations. But there's more that can be done here. The next step then, once I left government, was to provide consequences. Once attribution was publicly made, then the government needed to deploy consequences for the actions. And that's where you started to see somewhat of a coordinated approach in terms of sanctions, in terms of sort of law enforcement steps, indictments. But more could be done in that space, right? It looks like right now the government has been sort of in second gear trying to corral all of their law enforcement tools to be able to address this problem. Then there's the larger structural issues that the government is continuing to evolve. That's taking a coordinated approach, right, from the top and then infiltrate it throughout the entire government. That's engaging internationally, taking a collective approach. That's another area where there's some gaps that the government really needs to focus on. And then focus on better coordinated approach to disinformation. And Clint brought up quickly, I know that this is a foreign interference conversation, but the domestic issue here, the domestic threat here. So that's on the government side. So a lot's been done, but there's a lot more to do in the executive branch. Congress needs to, in my opinion, do better funding of the states and provide predictable funding and constant funding so that the states can make a plan and can budget appropriately. Those are some what would seem to be simple things to do, but turn out to be quite complex. The private sector has been doing a lot of work trying to fill some of the gaps, right? State and local governments and elections vendors generally don't have the resources for research and development, for example. So one of the things that Microsoft did and other companies are doing similar things is to develop a software development kit for encrypted, verified voting, right? So we've put a lot of research behind that. We've developed it and we've deployed it for free. So there are other things that private sector companies do. They provide, along with the government, technical assistance on the cybersecurity side for helping to protect information systems, elections information systems. And then, developing technology to help with identifying synthetic media, malicious synthetic media. These are things that are expensive. to develop and to deploy. So that's sort of an area that the private sector really does help fill some of those gaps.
Terrific. Thank you. Thomas, you talked about sort of the reasons why you don't view Iran as a very serious threat to elections right now in the United States. Are there things that you think the US government has actually done to reduce that threat? And are there other ways that the US government should be thinking about threats from Iran right now and responding to them?
Well, with respect to the fact that they don't seem to be very aggressive regarding the election in November, again, I think that goes back to the fact that they want Vice President Biden to win, and they want him to win because they want to go back to the nuclear agreement that was negotiated under the Obama administration in 2015. If that happens, then presumably tensions between Iran and the United States will decline somewhat. At the same time, the Iranians will still probably want the United States out of Iraq as much as possible. So an interesting thing will be after the November election is if there is a renegotiation of the nuclear treaty, will the Iranians continue to attack U.S. diplomatic and military targets in Iraq? And that remains to be seen. What the U.S. can do about that is continue to work with friendly Iraqi forces, including the government, to try to reduce the influence of Iraqi allied militia who are allied with the Iranian government. And also to keep in the back of one's options the use of military force. I think it's fair to say probably that Trump's killing of Soleimani, the leader of the Revolutionary Guards last January, it may have had something of a sobering effect upon Iranian calculations. So it's a gamut of diplomatic and military and policies.
And we've been seeing an enormous amount of activity out of the US government directed at China in a whole bunch of ways, not specifically about the election. Ray, I'm curious sort of if you were going to parse through some of that and talk about whether you think any of it has been effective in either insofar as trying to tamp down on interference with the election coming from China, or in terms of achieving what the US government wants to achieve with regards to China. What's been your assessment so far?
Well, in terms of how the American government has approached China, I think a lot of China analysts are seeing what we are calling a decoupling within the US-China relationship. So trade, people-to-people exchanges, certainly we expect the numbers of Chinese international students going to the United States to drop, both due to COVID and due to further pending restrictions in immigration and work visa policy. On the China side, where the jurisdiction of the Chinese government is strongest is also where we're starting to see the most aggressive speech and other types of crackdowns on Americans. We've had unseen numbers of journalists being expelled, including from the Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and speech and information control of foreign correspondents in China are far stricter than they have been in the past. And so with these sort of heightened tensions within the United States and China, the policy tools that we are seeing sort of being utilized on journalists, on diplomats abroad, the tit for tat closing of the Houston consulate, with the State Department saying that was used for espionage, and the retaliatory closing of the Chengdu consulate, which America used as a sort of as a home base to analyze China's Tibet policy. So all of these policy tools that we've seen being deployed are far sharper than they have been in the past.
Thank you. Clint, you've been following this since before the 2016 election, I know. So you've seen a whole range of different responses as Kemba sort of laid out a whole bunch of things that the US government has been doing. I'm curious from your perspective, have any of them worked? Have we made any progress?
Yeah, I think there is some progress. First, I'll say where the big gap is, which is legislatively, right? Of everything in the system, Capitol Hill has done nothing. I've testified several times. It has achieved no purpose. I mean, you continue to go there, no legislation comes out. The Honest Ads Act alone would help both foreign and domestic interference, or manipulation. So that part, I think, is troubling. On the better side of it, I think what you do see is kind of the video that we saw from the team for election defense last week. I mean, the FBI director, Chris Wray, they've been doing contact briefings. They've been notifying the social media companies, which then do takedowns. And we've seen a number of sites and accounts. Basically every month we're seeing a foreign influence takedown of some sort at this point. And that's that public-private partnership that we need. I think the other part, which is less visible, right, but has been highly effective, which is Cyber Command and on the NSA sort of side, which is they picked it up in 2018, going into the midterm election. I think you're seeing the insights and the preparation that they've done working in partnership with domestic entities like DHS, CISA, working with the FBI, and then how that's connected out to the private sector has all been very good. In fact, I think if you had a national security staff that wasn't in such disarray and turmoil and sort of like turnover all the time, and a legislative body that actually made laws regarding to election defense, you kind of would have a pretty good system overall. Like the institutions have plowed forward and done their mission as best as they can. And I think on the social media side, you're seeing overwhelming stand-up of resources compared to 4 years ago. I mean, when I talked to social media companies in 2015, they thought it was crazy that interference was going to be a big deal. So, I mean, the swing in terms of their perspective, I think has been remarkable. I think the last part, which we have not addressed, we've done so much awareness with the public on this that if you get duped by a Russian troll at this point, then you are trying to get duped by a Russian troll. Like that story has been absolutely beaten to death. And there's only so much more we can do, I think, in terms of public resilience, but just evaluating the demand for disinformation is sort of the unresearched part of this, which is there's still, as we see with phenomena like QAnon, there is a demand for conspiracies and disinformation separate from just the algorithms. And when you bring those two together, it's still a dangerous mix.
Thank you. So I want to remind people that there's a Q&A tool where you can submit questions and encourage people to do that if they have questions for any of our panelists. In the meantime, I want to ask each of you to really sort of give me the 2 or 3 things that if you were in charge, either for the next 3.5 weeks of making sure that the election was as robust and resilient interference as it could be, or thinking longer term ahead to 2024, thinking about what are the changes that need to be made, either from a legislative perspective or government intervention, or from a private industry. What are the sort of couple things that you think would make the biggest difference that we should be looking ahead to trying to do in this space? And Thomas, I'm going to come to you first. What do you think?
Well, let me just address Iran, and I won't address the election issue per se, because several of you are more qualified to do that than myself. But I do think that on a broader perspective, with respect to diplomacy, if we do go back to the nuclear agreement of 2015, in the event that Vice President Biden's elected, I do think that you'll have a decline in tensions, which would probably result in less interference on the part of Iran and in future elections. However, at the same time, I don't want to oversell that idea, because they still do want the United States out of Iraq, out of Syria. They're supporting their Houthi allies in Yemen. And so they'll continue to exist serious tensions there that could develop in election interference in some scenarios.
Thank you. Ray, what do you think? If it were up to you to make 2 or 3 changes, what would they be?
Sure. So I think the 2 things that would really change how the United States-China relationship impacts electoral security, and I think certain key diplomatic dimensions is, first of all, personal data laws that are enacted at the federal level. There's been a lot of buzz over bans of TikTok and WeChat. And even though there are issues of, data use, personal data mining capacities of these and how they're subjected, the parent companies at least, to Chinese cybersecurity laws, like broader personal data laws, I think is more effective than just playing whack-a-mole with specific companies that are utilizing and exploiting data in a malignant way. The second would be multilateral re-engagement in Asia and in spaces like the UN, because since I think last year or so, China has been much more active in standard setting and diplomatic engagement, and trying to take over or increase its presence in those types of spaces where traditionally the United States has been a much stronger voice, been a stronger participant in the past.
Thank you. All right, Clint, if you were going to actually write the law that you've been waiting for Congress to pass after briefing them all these times, what would you have the government do?
I think they've written versions of it already, right? The Honest Ads Act is super simple. In fact, I was even with a former Republican congressman at the Green Room at 30 Rock once, and he was like, I didn't realize this wasn't already a law. Like, he just didn't even know that you could lie on social media. So, like, that's kind of just a basic standard. The other one is not accepting foreign influence or interference from a foreign country. Very basic. That could have stopped the main vector from Russia this time around. So those 2, I think, are big ones. And I think the third one is the election integrity, strengthening the stuff that Kemba was talking about. Like, let's just have some basic standards around how votes are counted so that we know how they're counted. And we don't have to make every system the same, but can we create a standard around the country where everyone's comfortable, they know the authenticity of their vote? I think separate and beyond that, I mean, on the foreign interference portion of it, we have imposed no cost. So even to this day, if I were Russia, China, Iran, or any of these countries, I would continue to do this because it is extremely low cost. It's highly effective. And at this point, you're mostly using vitriolic domestic disinfo and just resending it back to American audiences in a very targeted way and undermining democracy. So we have to decide, like, when will we fight back? And we haven't done it. There's been no real strategy around that. And so honestly, I can't blame any of the adversaries I track, because if I were them, I would just keep going. Nothing happens when you lose a Facebook account. Oh, okay, that's 10 minutes, right? Like, the loss is not significant enough, at least at this point.
Thank you. Kemba, what do you think? What are the sort of things that we need to be doing to make sure that this actually does cost the adversaries who are doing it?
So ditto to everything that Ray, Clinton, Thomas have already outlined. But I'll just add a couple of more that should be obvious. In my view, the best antidote to foreign interference in our elections is to genuinely go vote. Just encourage voting, however that is, through absentee balloting, through in-person voting. So that would be the first thing. The second would be to do what it takes at every level of government to restore trust in our democratic institutions, right? So if that's for a technology company creating something like Election Guard, if that's for Congress to pass the Honest Ads Act or something similar to it, just restoring integrity, restoring trust in our democratic process. And the third, I'll just reflect what Ray and Thomas raised, is to really consider engaging internationally again. I mean, although I believe our current biggest threat is, and I agree with the U.S. government here, is a domestic threat. I do believe that we've fallen behind in international engagement and addressing interference, elections interference in our democratic processes in general.
So we do have some audience questions now. I'm going to come to them. Sean asks, I think specifically for Clint, though others may have ideas, if you could talk a little bit more about the domestic interference and what kinds of activities or trends you're observing this time around, how they're different from some of the foreign influence operations, whether the mitigation measures for foreign and domestic interference are different, and where you see that going.
So for domestic, I think it's, you see on scale and volume, whatever your worst Facebook friend does every single day times 100,000, right? Like the issue is that they have learned this sort of technique. And if you watch recent arrest indictments, the troll farm in the US that was essentially taken down yesterday, I believe it was, by Facebook, they're just copying the techniques. And I think what has always been the next generation after nation states in terms of election interference is what I call trolling as a service, which is just buying and aggregating data in a successful way that you're employing it in a very negative, derisive sort of way towards democracy as a whole. And by that, I mean, people got really excited about Cambridge Analytica. They kind of oversold what they were able to do. They were also just the worst that they were able at what they do, and that's why they got caught. There are many other firms out there that are doing those sorts of techniques and using those skills. I think the next part to sort of think about is the activism is almost turned into just straight trolling that could, you know, depending on how you view this, I think it'll be the fight of censorship and whether we're censoring people or not is what is really free speech when it starts to do harm and where are the harms at. There are some local election races around the country right now that are nothing short of absolutely insane that I've encountered, you know, in terms of local people creating false, you know, videos about people, dumping them onto the internet and local spaces. And so that's really going to take civil society to solve that. And it will take, you know, congressmen and legislation to make decisions about that. I think the underlying part of it is the broader trend of dividedness, which makes us weaker towards foreign interference. So I think that's the big thing that I see as a trend this time. The other part, which is what, without a doubt, my biggest concern this time is mobilizations to polling places by domestic groups heading in. And we just saw the Michigan militia issue yesterday with Governor Whitmer. I think that is just probably one of many plots that's out there right now. And I think everything we are doing is almost focused on that, and with maybe a little bit of foreign agitation on top. And that could be solved by elected leaders coming out and saying, we're not going to do this, right? Like that's a leadership thing as much as the social media companies and other entities sort of dealing with it.
Anybody else have thoughts on domestic interference that they want to chime in with?
I'll be remiss if I don't say just everything that Clint said was spot on. But I just wanted to point out that the United States is sort of in a unique space. We have sort of a crisis of racism, a crisis of reckoning against racism in the United States, and it's a simple issue to create a wedge, right? To weaponize, and that's an example of something that you wouldn't necessarily associate in connection with election security or election interference, but it happened in 2016, and it's happening again.
So we have another audience question from somebody asking, what do you see as the ways out of the cycle of negative action and counteraction between the United States and foreign nations influencing the 2020 election? How do we escape a negative spiral of sanctions and restrictions in response to interference? I'm curious sort of if any of you have thoughts on how you see this continuing in a productive direction rather than in what this question asker regards as a negative spiral. Thomas, I'm going to ask if you have thoughts on sort of what would be a more productive direction to take this in here.
Okay, I'll address the case of Iran. And as I said before, I think you're talking about a combination of some greater flexibility on the part of the US and at the same time, firmness vis-a-vis Iran. This is not just a kind of relationship of Iran does something, the US reacts, Iran reacts to that, etc. This is a struggle for influence in the Middle East. And the Iranians are trying to maximize their influence throughout the Middle East. If I'm told, if you go to the website of Ayatollah Khamenei, he refers to himself as the leader of the Muslims worldwide. So diplomatic adjustments can help you, but only up to a point. Having said that, I do think that if we go back to the Iranian, the nuclear agreement of 2015, in which the Iranians suspended their nuclear weapons program. They didn't end it, and you can debate about whether we should have pushed them harder back then, but they did suspend it, and in return, economic sanctions were largely eliminated. So if we go back to that, I think that's would be a major step forward. Having said that, you're still going to have continued tension and competition between the United States and Iran. And there's nothing really much you can do about that, but to be firm, support friendly Muslim countries that are opposed to Iran, and hopefully at some point when the Iranians beat their head against the wall and reach the limits of the extent of their influence, then they will begin to change as a regime. It's a midterm prospect though, not a short-term one.
Thank you. One more audience question from Oliver, who wants to know, does the United States attempt to influence elections in other countries in the same way that other countries are trying to influence US elections? Have any of you looked at all at that question?
I think historically, Tom is probably better on this than me. This is the retort I usually get when I do my presentations, when someone brings up like Chile in the 1970s and then kind of conflates it with 2016 Russia cyber. So I can speak to the cyber sort of portion of it, which is that there is a major difference even between the three countries we talked about here, at least what they've done so far, for election interference in terms of scale and the way it focuses on both elected officials and civilians. That's the big difference. I am not aware, maybe this has happened somewhere, of the United States hacking a political campaign while impersonating Russian citizens, dumping their information into the Russian media during a cycle, to then follow up with further hacks against Russian voting systems. So this is where I think it is. If you ask Putin, he would say, well, you do democracy promotion, all over Europe, you're doing it too, as if that's kind of a false equivalency. So I am not aware of it. I would be shocked, and I hope the United States never does it. Historical context of the US and elections, I think that is a different sort of frame, and probably the political scientists will know that much better than me.
I can comment on that if you like. With respect to involvement with foreign elections by the United States, the most clear cases, I think, were in 1948, when we supported the Christian Democrats in the Italian election. The communists were very strong then, and we supported the Christian Democrats by handing out funds and maybe even helping to mobilize Italian Americans in this country. I'm less sure about that. So that was a clear case, yes. And at least I, for one, have no apologies about doing that. That country was very vulnerable at that point. It was part of our policy to defend democracy throughout Europe, which was largely successful. And that was the clearest case. We may also have supported non-communist forces in France, because the French Communist Party was also very strong then, but I'm not sure about that. In Latin America, again, I'm not an expert in this. Someone mentioned the case of Allende. I believe in that case, in that election, we were not involved in a major way. We were afterwards, after Allende came in power, but not before. In fact, if there had been a runoff in the 1970 election, Allende never would have been elected. But the forces to the left, to the right of Allende were split. But I don't think the U.S. was involved in interference in that election, from what I remember. 1948, yes, clearly.
Thank you. Super helpful historical context. Ray, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I would add, as a recent note, that one sort of retort that China has had in response to protests in Hong Kong, especially 2019 onwards, were that these protests were the work of foreign interference or foreign influence by the United States, and has sought to link certain more notable protesters in Hong Kong to the United States government. These claims have not been substantiated, but the sort of potential, like the potential sort of misinformation that is floating around on, I think, Hong Kong, how Chinese state media has spun the origins of COVID, all of these sort of, American government issue origins have definitely been something that they've tried to push out to sow certain types of uncertainty.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left. I want to give each of you about a minute to talk about what you think is the piece of US election interference that people aren't thinking and talking about, but should be. I think, Clint brought up at this point, if you haven't read a piece about the Russian troll farms, then you're really trying to avoid news about this. There's been a fair amount of publicity and awareness around some elements of this. And especially as we head into an election, I'm curious sort of what it is that you think should be on people's minds, what's on your mind about the election, and what should we be sort of keeping at the front of our minds. Ray, I'm going to come to you first.
I think people's information diets within the last couple of weeks, I think it's going to be pretty sensitive, especially for swing states in the United States. And so I think how people receive, process news, both domestic and international, I think is going to be a really critical factor.
Thank you. Clint, what do you think?
Safety at polling places. I have already kind of alluded to that. I think that's it kind of exposed itself yesterday, in Michigan, but there's a lot of that. And hopefully, what happened yesterday will send a warning to all the other states that may be vulnerable to this and sort of preempt it. I'm hoping it's an inoculation and not a trend.
Thank you. Kemba.
Trying to think of anything that hasn't been said already. So I'll just say the same thing again. I think voting is one of the best antidotes to what we're talking about here. Encouraging increased voter turnout, exercising that right, I think is going to be important.
Always a good thing to hear in October. Thomas.
Well, I'll restrict my comments to the Islamic world. I'll go a bit beyond Iran. I mentioned previously why the Iranians probably have concluded it's not a good idea to try something kind of spectacular to try to influence the November election. There's always the possibility you could get foreign extremists, terrorists to try some spectacular operation in order to embarrass the United States government around election time. It's unlikely, but not entirely impossible. And all you can really do about that is keep vigilant with your intelligence community.
Thank you all so much. I'm really grateful to you, especially because I know this is a moment when you all have a lot of very sort of pressing and important work to be doing on these issues. So I'm very grateful to you for taking the time out of your day to join us for this panel. I also want to say a word of thanks to the whole leadership team of the Murrow Conference on New Media, Tech, and Democracy, a really spectacular group of students and staff who came together and figured out how to move this all online and coordinate it across a number of different time zones and platforms. And I did a spectacular job. I hope all of you have enjoyed the panels throughout the day on a range of different issues, from free speech to media, biometrics, disinformation. And I've been sort of really blown away. I've learned a lot. And I'm so grateful to all of you who have joined as well and made it feel like we're still able to hold a conference and come together and talk about these important issues.
All right, without further